along with R code chunks. And in those chunks, you get to put in your R code. And when you process the document, you get to see not just your code, but also your output as well. So the main reason for using R Markdown is really reproducibility. In a non-reproducible workflow, you could perhaps be doing your work in R, creating, say, some plots or output, copying and pasting those into a different text processing editor, so maybe something like Microsoft Word or Google Docs, and you basically have this human element in between the output that R generates and the document that you're putting together, which is generally error prone, right? The human in the middle can easily fail in the sense that you might forget to update something. You might update your code, but you might forget to copy and paste it into your document. With R Markdown, we're taking that human out of the equation at that stage. Obviously, we're not completely taking the human out of the equation of doing the data analysis, but we're taking the human out of the equation of making sure that updates are being made. You write your code in the document, you hit knit, and then the results are reflected. Nobody needs to remember to update a second thing at this point. So what I'd like to do to begin with is, start with a demo. And we're going to go through 6 demos throughout this talk. So I'm going to have a slide like this for each one of the 6 demos. And if you would like to follow along with me, you are welcome to do so at this link in the middle of the screen, not street. So that's rstd.io. /rmd-custom-cloud will get you to a RStudio Cloud project that basically has the starter documents that I'm going to be working with. And I'm emphasizing starter documents because during the demos, we'll basically work on those documents and try to make the points that I'm trying to make here. And what I'm going to do after the workshop is go back to that RStudio Cloud space and in a way, like upload the answers. So things that we've actually worked through. So if you're watching this recording later, or you want to refer back to your notes, you'll be able to have what I developed during the workshop there. But if you want to follow along as I'm talking, this is an opportunity for you to be typing a little bit of code as opposed to just listening to me as well. So if you were to copy this, and what I will do is I might actually... Oh, okay. Somebody already shared. Thank you so much. So if you click on that link from the chat, so let's go ahead and do that together. You should get to login screen first. So I logged into testing. So you could log in with a GitHub ID or a Google ID if you want, or if you have a Shiny Apps account with RStudio, you could log in with that as well. And you're going to basically get to a screen like this, okay? And once you do, the first thing you might want to do is to click on this temporary copy button, just so you can actually save a copy of it. So sorry, here on the save a permanent copy. That way your work that you're working on can be saved. So this becomes your project at this point, your RStudio Cloud project. You can basically simply work on it from there. If you want to just watch, that's perfectly fine as well. But let's start with the first document, which is the O1 RMD simple.rmd. That's in the files pane here. And what I'll do is I'll zoom in my window a little bit more and let's walk through it. So as I was preparing the workshop materials, I was thinking about, I wonder like what sort of data analysis example I should put into this. And a friend of mine actually works on this research project called the Amboseli Baboon Research Project. Her name is Jenny Tung. So I messaged her to say, hey, I wonder, like, can you tell me something about Kenya that might be, that people will recognize? And she said that they actually have some data available on their research project kind of page, and also a color palette, an R package with a color palette with the Amboseli skyline. So I figured, well, let's go ahead and go with that. So this is a mock example of a data analysis that uses rainfall data in Amboseli. So what we're going to do is we're going to, in this particular example, create a simple visualization of rainfall in Amboseli, Kenya, in wet and dry seasons over the 40 plus years. So what I just read to you is basically what we're seeing here in the kind of the prose part of the document. But let's take a look at the structure of this document a little bit. And before we actually take a look at the source code, what I'd like to do is I'd like to knit the document so we can look at the source code and the output together. And before I knit, I don't quite like pop-up windows when I'm working on things. So I'm going to click on this gear icon and say that I want to preview my document, my knit document in the viewer pane. And then I'm going to hit knit so that when the document knits, it actually shows up right here on the viewer pane of my RStudio editor. Okay, so let's take a look at some of these one-to-one comparisons. I have the title, Rainfall in Amboseli, Kenya here, and we can see that it has been formatted in a particular way with bigger text on the output. I have my name, I have a date here. Maybe let's go ahead and update this date for today. And then I can go ahead and knit with each update that I make, and I can see that reflected on my document. We can see that text simply is transferred over as text, nothing new there. And then we have some headings here, for example, and we can see that those are translated to kind of bigger text that appear distinct from the rest of the prose. And finally, let's get to the exciting part of including R code. So over here, I'm including some R code where I'm reloading the packages that I'm going to use in my analysis. And so let me point out a few things here. In an R chunk, one of the things I have is a label. This is a label. I can name it whatever I want, but it's not useful to name it something, unrecognizable. We want to try to come up with a label that has no spaces in it, that is short so that it doesn't take up too much space, but that's also informative about what's happening in that chunk. This is not mandatory, but one nice thing about having labels for your chunks is that you can use this navigator at the bottom of your R Markdown kind of editor screen to actually jump between R chunks. And also another thing that's helpful about this is that let's go ahead and assume that I had a mistake in my R chunk, and I'm purposefully deleting a close parenthesis so that I have a mistake in my R chunk, and I am going to go ahead and knit the document. It makes it a bit easier to identify where that mistake happened. Another thing that I'll talk about, we're seeing something else here, message equals false. Let's get back to that in a little bit. But now let's scroll down and we can see that some of our R Markdown documents, some of our R chunks, we're simply doing some computation, but then not printing anything out. So we can see that for that, only the code is reflected. But for some of them, if I scroll down a little bit here, I basically ultimately am making a ggplot, right? I am creating a plot. So if I scroll down to the bottom of my output, not only am I seeing my prose and my code, but I'm also able to see my plot as well. So what we have here is the rainfall. I believe the data goes from 1977 to 2020. And the seasons are separated into wet season and dry season. I hope I got all of this right. I did a little bit of like Wikipedia reading yesterday to try to make sure we're getting the seasons right. I think if I remember correctly, June through October is the dry season. So those are coded as that. And then the rest of it is the wet season. And we can see, lower rainfall in the dry season. But let's for a second assume that I had made a mistake. Okay, let's for a second assume that actually October isn't supposed to be here. The strength of our Markdown is that if you are to change a single thing in your data analysis and you simply want to recreate a visualization, all it takes is changing it in your code and then knitting again. So I don't have to actually do a whole bunch of new work. I'm able to basically reflect all of those changes in my document pretty quickly, because all I have to do is make the one change to my code and then knit again. And I'm going to go back and put this back because I believe this is the right way to keep it. So I've talked about kind of how we bring together prose and code together. I've talked a little bit about the benefit of having chunk labels. In addition to just being informative, the navigability is really nice. And let me show you one other thing before we go back and talk about customizing this a little bit. And that is this outline button here. So this is something I use very regularly, especially when I'm creating long R Markdown documents. Because, if you're creating like a long slide deck or something like that, it makes it a lot easier to navigate and see like what is happening in your document. Okay, so we'll leave this here for a second and go back to the slides. And what I'm going to do next is, instead of talking about customizing our Markdown, I'm going to take an aside for a second and introduce you to the visual editor. It is not brand new, but it is newish. And whenever, I am talking about our Markdown, I try to make a point to discuss the visual editor a little bit as well, because it's one of my new favorite features. And we'll also get to demo a few things that makes your life easier when you're authoring in our Markdown if you're using the visual editor. So, this is looking at the exact same document we saw before, and the screenshot at the bottom of these slides might look familiar from earlier. However, if we focus on the left-hand side, you'll see that we're not seeing those, for example, hashtags to identify our headers, for example. What we're seeing is basically text that's already styled as a header, where the YAML still looks like source code, but everything else looks like rendered text. So what the visual editor gets us is basically visual editing. So we are writing as though we're writing, say, in a Google Doc or a Word document, as opposed to something that looks more like a source code. It has great support for citations, which I'm going to demo in a second. It makes it a lot easier to do cross-referencing and footnotes and stuff like that. In addition, and you can also include LaTeX and equations in your documents. It has real-time spell checking. So you can see here, for example, the word ambasali is highlighted as, because it doesn't recognize it as a word, so that's not necessarily a mistake. I could add it to my dictionary, but we can see that it's highlighting them at the time. And the outline that view that I showed you on the sidebar is available here as well. And it's tightly integrated with source editing. So if at any point you need to debug things, it's very easy to switch between the source editing and the visual editing. So I'll show you that in a second as well. And there's like a really nice catch-all shortcut for inserting pretty much anything into your document. So let's go ahead and demo this too. So I'm going to go back to RStudio Cloud, and this time I'm going to open the document that says O2 Visual Editor, and then we'll kind of go from there. So let's go ahead and close this document and open the visual editor document. And right now it looks exactly like the first document that I had. So I am going to click on this compass icon here that says switch to visual markdown editor. And we're going to let it do its thing for a second. And basically it gives me this little notice saying I'm activating the R Markdown visual editing mode. And it says you can switch between things. It gives me a link where I can learn more about the visual editor. And it also says that visual mode will rewrite your Markdown source. So this is important to note because it will actually touch your text a little bit and format it slightly differently. For example, a very minor example I'll give is that if you have bulleted lists, it will put like 2 spaces after the maybe a dash or a star you might have had to indicate a bullet. So it will make some of these changes under the hood for you, and you can, and then you'll be able to, edit those further if you feel like there was, it mangled your document in a way you don't want. But I think at this point, it's been pretty reliable in terms of the translation that it does. So here is the visual editor, basically. We are basically seeing that the YAML, the top, where we have the metadata about our document, looks exactly the same, but other things have changed. So the document is a little bit easier to read, in my opinion, because we're not just looking at source code. I can see I've made, for example, a spelling mistake here. So I can just right click on it and change it. It shows me kind of on the spot where I have mistakes. And you're seeing that otherwise it's basically the same document. And if I were to knit this, and let's make sure that I'm going to knit it in the viewer pane. If I were to knit this, we're going to see that the output looks exactly the same as well. I have a mistake in code. So let's go ahead and fix that. There we go. All right, so we're able to basically see our output. So let's go ahead and highlight a few things about the visual editor. So one of the things I said I really like about it is the ease with which you can insert citations. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to insert a citation for the tidyverse, okay? I happen to know, I looked this up ahead of time. I happen to know the document, identifier, the DOI for the Welcome to the Tidyverse paper. And so over here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the command and / to say I want to insert a citation. And I will say that I want to insert that citation from a DOI. And let's go ahead and paste that. So this is the citation that I want to insert. I don't want it to be an in-text citation, so I'm not going to click that, this one here. And then I'm just going to click insert. And I can see that a few things have happened. My YAML gained a new line that tells me what where the bibliography file is saved. And I can see that if I go to my files pane, now there's a references.bib that was just created. And if I were to knit my document, I will be able to see that the reference has been included here and also at the bottom of my document as well. So the neat thing about this is that you don't have to be authoring your bib file. It will author it for you. I've given a simple example of pulling in from DOI, but if you use citation managers like Zotero or something, you can link things up as well. Another thing I will show is kind of the table editing, which is, I think, something that's a little bit tedious to do in a Markdown document. So let's go ahead and say, so here is in the narrative where I had talked about what the wet season is identified as and what the dry season is identified as. Let's go ahead and insert a table here. So I'm going to say, I want to insert a table. Let's have it have 3 rows, and I'll say 2 columns. And then let's give it a caption. Maybe season, month, lookup, something like this. So here is the season, here is the months it corresponds to. So we know that if this is the wet season is June through October. And then our dry season is November through May. So I get to kind of show you a few more things here. In terms of changing text formatting, I am able to use the buttons here to go from, say, code text to kind of plain text. I clearly did not need my 3rd row, so let's go ahead and delete this row. And now I basically have a table inserted here. And let's go ahead and knit this document to see how it looks like on the output side. So we can see that it basically looks like this on the output side as well. I can obviously edit the table further, do alignments and stuff like that, but we'll leave that there. Basically, I wanted to show you the ease with which you can insert tables as well. And to wrap things up, I will also show you how do we insert a chunk. So I generally use this shortcut, so the command and then /, and I can insert an R code chunk or any of the other engines that R Markdown is able to use. And you'll see that it looks a little bit different here. We don't see the backticks that we're used to seeing in an R Markdown document, but it's basically the same R Markdown chunk. So what I'll do right now is I will now go back to the source editor to show you how these two things correspond to each other.
Excuse me, Dr. Mina.
Yeah.
Sorry for interrupting you. So, but there's a question here that
Sure.
you probably want to cover before you proceed. So there's in the audience someone requesting you to go over the citation, inserting the incitation again.
Sure. I would be happy to do that. So let's go ahead and do that. So what I did is I did command and then / to bring this kind of catch-all navigation. But I could also, alternatively, do something like insert and then citation. And then I said that I'm going to insert a citation from a DOI. So I had looked up, from somewhere like Google Scholar, the DOI for the Tidyverse paper. And so I searched, and what it does is it actually goes out to the web and searches for the document. And then once it finds it, it gives it a little ID here. And then I can say insert, and it basically inserts that into my document. Hopefully that clarifies that.
Hope so.
All right, great. So let's go ahead and save this. And now I'm going to exit out of the visual editor mode just to show you what my text looks like under the hood in the source editor mode. So you can see that actually my R chunks look exactly the same as what we're used to seeing with the backticks and stuff. It's just that formatting wasn't visible so that things look a little bit cleaner and leaner in the visual editing mode. And then another thing that I really like about the visual editor is it makes it easy to do sentence level breaks. So you can actually set it up so that each sentence could go to its own line. So let's go ahead and try to do that. And that'll be the last thing I show with this. So I'm going to change my project option. So that was tools and then project options, R Markdown. And then for automatic text wrapping, I personally like using the sentence level wrapping. So if I now switch to the visual editor and save my document and switch back, you can see that it places each sentence on its own line, which is super helpful if you're writing a document collaboratively and if you're tracking it with version control, so that when your collaborator makes edits, each one of them show up on their own line. So you don't have to hit enter and remember to put your sentences on a new line. It will kind of do it for you under the hood. But when you're actually editing the document in the visual editor mode, you don't see those line breaks, but it's there in the source code. Okay, so that's kind of it about the visual editor for the time being. So I will save things here and go back to my slides to talk about the next thing, which is customizing chunk options. So what do I mean by customizing chunk options? We can customize our chunks to either show or hide the content or the output of it. So we can say set message equals false and warning equals false to suppress messages and warnings. And that was one of the things I had in my first code chunk where I was loading packages, because Tidyverse is quite chatty and it tells me which packages it's loading and what functions it might be overwriting, which is good to see the first time, but I generally don't want to see that in my output. But while it's possible to do this, it's really important to do this with caution, because those messages and warnings are there for a reason. So you want to make sure that you see them the first time around, but then it's up to you to hide them. You can set error equals true in your code chunks, which means that your document will always knit even if there's an error, and the error will then print on your output. That's a neat thing to do, especially if you're using R Markdown for creating teaching documents and you actually want to show the error to your students. So you don't have to mock it up yourself. You can put code that is buggy into the R chunk and then let R Markdown print the error for you in the output. And finally, include equals false is a useful way of turning off a bunch of things at once. It basically means that that code chunk will run. However, the output, messages, warnings, whatnot will all be hidden. So that's the sort of stuff where you want to do under the hood in your document, but you don't want to be reflected at all in your output. Other options that are useful to take note of are those for figures. So I'm sure that if you are an R Markdown user, at some point you've found yourself in a situation where you create a visualization in R and you like it, and then you put the code in your R Markdown document, and all of a sudden the ratio is off, like the aspect ratio is off, or things are looking a little bit blurry. So there are some chunk options that you can set that will make life easier for you to have like beautiful images in the output of your R Markdown documents as well.
Sorry
yeah,
again,
yeah.
Dr. Mina. Sorry, again, there's another burning question here that probably you might want to help.
Mm-hmm.
So,
sure.
So participants trying to follow along, but they're not able to actually activate the visual editor in their RStudio. So they're asking if is there something they must install, like an add-on or something?
So if you are following along with on RStudio Cloud, it should work for you. However, if you're following along locally, you need to have RStudio version 1.4 for the visual editor, and that might be the reason why you're not seeing that. So maybe it would be useful for those of you who are having that issue. If you're following along and you're not seeing the visual editor, I would guess that the reason is that you don't have RStudio 1.4, which if you just download the released version right now, that should have the visual editor capability. So it's not a package you need to install, but it's a particular version of RStudio. Another reason, if you're unable to knit the document locally, so if you're, again, using things on cloud, all of the packages you need should be installed for you. But in the chat, comment was made about that R Embassy package that I'm using to get colors from. So I've noted here that that package is not on CRAN. So if you actually want to work on this locally and follow along, you're going to need to install that from GitHub, and the comment for that is here as well. It's quite possible that you don't have the same set of packages I'm using to follow along locally. So if you are quite interested in following along, maybe using RStudio Cloud just for the duration of the workshop is useful, you can always go back and download all the materials from GitHub, again, to work on them locally in your own install. Let me also maybe answer this question here about the difference between R Notebook and R Markdown file. So you can think of an R Notebook as, so if you were to go ahead and say, you want to create a new document, it's either an R Notebook or R Markdown. You can think of the notebook more like a Jupyter notebook as well, where it's designed to kind of show the chunk output in the notebook itself, so as opposed to in the console by default. So I generally, it's using the same knitter engine under the hood, but it's a slightly different editing experience. But the one I'm talking about is R Markdown. Personally, I'm not a big fan of my output showing up in my document. I like it when I click this little button. So that's why I'm generally an R Markdown user as opposed to a notebook user. So going back to the options for figures. So there are a few that I've listed here, and I'll demo these in a second for you. But you probably want to change the retina definition. That's about kind of how crisp your figure is. I like setting a width for my figures for my entire document at once, roughly about 70% of the width of my page. The figure width is actually in inches here. So that's about how big that image is as a stored file on your computer. And finally, this is a number. I don't know if people will recognize this number, but it's basically the golden ratio. It's supposed to be a visually pleasing aspect ratio that generally works well for a single figure. So that's basically saying the height of your figure is 0.618 the width of your figure. And finally, whenever you're including figures in your document, particularly if the output is HTML and it's going to be like a web-ready document, it's highly recommended that you also add some alternative text to increase kind of the accessibility of your document as well. So I'll show you how we put that into the chunk definition as well. This is only like skimming the top of some of the tips for chunk options for better figures in your R Markdown document. From the slides, you'll see two resources linked. One of them is a chapter from the R for Data Science book called Graphics for Communication that has these same tips and much more. And then the other one is a blog post by Zev Ross on tips and tricks for working with images and figures in our Markdown documents. It's a really comprehensive and very good blog post that tells you basically everything you need to know about all the various chunk options that you might want for your R Markdown document, particularly with reference to pulling in images and also including figures. And then you can also set these chunk options not just at the local level, but at the global level as well. So for the entire document. So the knitter package, which is the engine that's, making this whole literate programming paradigm work, that is bringing in the text and the code together, has a function for setting chunk options. So that's what that's short for, options chunk, for setting them at the document level. So I would recommend setting these best practice recommendations for your figures at the global level. And then if individual figures need some tweaking, you can go ahead and tweak them at the chunk level and those will override them. So let's go ahead and open up the third document with chunk options and add some of these. And we'll answer the question about the fig alt here as we do that as well. So I'm going to close the second file. I'm going to go here and open the document called O3 chunk options. Remember that I had one mistake here with my links, with the path to my data. So I'm going to correct that. Let's go ahead and turn to the visual editor too. Why not? And now we have our document. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to knit this document first. So let's go ahead and knit it so that we can see the output and make sure that it's working. And here we can see our visualization as well. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to add an R chunk. And I am going to include the global settings that I showed you on my slides. So that's basically increasing the retina to 3, making my figure 70% of my paper, and setting a particular width and an aspect ratio. So let's go ahead and knit the document again to see what our figure looks like. So you can see that now it's shrunk a little bit because I made it 70% the width. Just to show you what things would look like if this number was lower. So we had a lower kind of crispness level in a way to our image. You can see the image gets blurry as that number gets smaller. So I'm going to set it back to 3. Even though I have this global setting, if I have multiple visualizations in my document and I want to actually change the settings for some of the visualizations, I can always override the global settings by going to the R chunk that produces that code. And let's go ahead and say, no, for this one, make it 100%. And this will basically override the global setting and blow up my plot again to make it bigger. The fig alt, so is basically this definition here. So that's a chunk option that basically creates an alt text. So the way you can see the alt text is if I pop this out to a new window, for folks who are able to see this visualization, the alternative text is not necessarily something that's visible on the page. But if I hover over it, you can see that alternative text. But the main audience for that alternative text is not folks who can necessarily read what you can see there when you hover over it, but those who are using a screen reader. Since if they are not able to see the visualization themselves, but they're using a screen reader to scan through the document, the screen reader will actually read the alternative text for them. For making your images center aligned, so let's go ahead and take this out so that my image is actually just 70% as dictated by the global options. I can say fig align, and I can say that I want it to be center aligned. So that will now make it 70%, but put my figure in the center. The last thing I'll show in terms of the chunk options is, so this is a document that might be useful to share with, with collaborators who also write R code. But otherwise, if you are presenting this document to an audience who's only interested in the output, so your prose and the figures and stuff, but not the code, we wouldn't necessarily want to give them a document that has all of this R code in it, right? So how do we get rid of that? One thing you can do is for an individual chunk, we can basically say something like echo equals false, and then it will hide that particular code chunk, but leave the rest in there. Or I can say that I want echo equals false for my entire document. So this is putting it in the global options and knit my document. And all of a sudden, I basically have a document that is, that is just my prose and my output. None of my code is visible in the output, but it is there if I actually want to go back and make changes to any of my analysis. It's easy enough for me to do, and that I can simply reproduce the document that way. So let me go ahead and paste the chunk options in the chat quickly. So that's including the echo equals false. Let me also answer the question about the R scripts and R Markdown. So if your analysis is a simple one that it makes sense to include in a single R Markdown document, this is great. So this is a great example of a simple analysis. There's no really reason for an additional R script or something. But you might be working on something a lot more complex where maybe you don't want to redo your computation each time you want to make changes to the prose of your document and knit. If one of these chunks was taking a long time to compute, we wouldn't want to be keeping knit over and over. So what you might want to do is do some of your computation elsewhere in R scripts, maybe save the output of those as RDS files, and then pull the output into your R Markdown document that you're using to write your final report, for example. So I would recommend ultimately all of that work to be stored in the same directory. But let me show you one thing that we're doing here. So for example, I have my data stored in a folder called data, generally a good recommendation for where to put your data. And if I was to have another R script here, maybe I'll call this something like lots of complicated code.R. So let's imagine that I have lots of computation that I have to do here, but to do all of this computation, I actually need to use the same data file where I would basically have this R script where I have the same R code for loading the data, and they're all living in the same directory, which means that I don't have to repeat where my data is stored. So I only have one copy of my data file. I can call it in my R script. I can call it in my R Markdown document. So yes, I would recommend all of that lives in the same overall project directory, and then keeping your data or other inputs in separate folders and then pulling them in from there.
So there's a, sorry, Dr. Amina, there's a question from someone watching live stream YouTube. So they asking if the chunk option for image, I think that the one, is it for centering? Does it work with the Plotly as well?
I would imagine the answer is yes, but I'm guessing that the question is arising from the answer being no, maybe. Maybe the person has tried it and it didn't work. So I'm not sure. It is possible that with some packages, especially those that, use perhaps a different rendering engine for getting the images on the screen, maybe some of the chunk options behave a little bit differently. I wouldn't be too surprised, but I don't know the answer to how you center a Plotly image off the top of my head. So let's go back. Oh, okay. So let me answer this question about the here package as well. So that's a good question, and I haven't addressed this before. So let's go back to this is still the third document that I'm working with, this chunk options document, and I'm going to discuss a little bit, why do I have this here? So to clarify, the name of the package is here, and the name of the function is here as well. And the reason why I generally have the two of them together is that there is, or at least there used to be, a function called here in the lubridate package, which is also a package I used a lot. And sometimes they would get confused. So I've just gotten into the habit of, whenever I use the here function, I actually use the package name right before it as well, just to make sure it's clear which here function I'm using. And also it's kind of fun to say here, and that's why I do that. But why am I doing that? So let's go ahead and comment this out for a second, and I'm going to change the code. So I'm going to copy my code and say that I just want to read from this folder, data slash, how about we do this? In order to make sure that I can actually do this, I'm going to create a new folder here called some more R Markdown documents, okay? And I am going to make a copy of this file that we were working with into here. And I'm going to name it something that says in another folder, so it's very clear what we're working on, okay? So let's go ahead and close out of this, and let's go into this document called some more RMDs. And I'm working with this document, and I know that my data is stored in this project in a folder called data, and it's called Amboseli Rainfall 2020.xls. Let's go ahead and try to knit this document and see what happens. So it tells me that this path doesn't exist. It says I can't find the data folder. Why can't it find the data folder? Because this particular R Markdown document lives in this folder called some more RMDs, and there is no data folder here. The data folder is one level above. So I can say, okay, then go one level above like this, and then knit the document for me. All is well. So now it can find the data folder and it can knit the document and everything is working. Let's say I'm doing a little bit more and I decide I just want to run a few lines of code in my console to try some things out. So then I try to say, oh, I want to go ahead and run this current chunk. Oh, sorry, let's load our packages in our console. And then let's say I want to run this current chunk. So the working directory for running your current chunk is here in this kind of the project folder, but the data lives kind of in this folder called data, and the R Markdown document I was working with lives in another folder. So when you have this complicated folder structure and you just want to make sure that you are always starting that the root directory that you're starting it is always the same, you can basically say always start here, regardless of where I'm running my code from. So this here, the definition we had for pulling the data from basically always starting in the root of your project and then going to the data directory. That's what the here package is helpful for. The reason why things got confused in my mind is that the way I think the working directory is defined in an RStudio Cloud project is a little bit different than what you would expect to see on your local computer. And that's why I tried to do a demo and it kind of failed for you because I was thinking about how I would do the demo locally on my computer. But the moral of the story, I guess I can say, is that if you are going to be sometimes knitting your document and sometimes running your chunks individually, I would recommend, instead of hard coding the path to your data, always starting with the here function to find the root of the project and then define where your data is stored from there. That will allow you, regardless of who is running your code and where it's being run, cloud or locally or whatnot, as long as you have your RStudio project open, it will always find the root and then look for the data continuing from there. So what this function is doing is it's basically constructing a path to your data that starts at the root and then adds the folders and the file names that you've given to that. Hopefully that answers the question. And I'm sorry about the minor confusion along the way, because I wasn't thinking in that RStudio Cloud context for a second. I'll delete that since that was a side demo and then leave the rest there. All right, I think we've answered the other questions in the chat. So let's move on now to customizing output. So what do I mean by customizing output? Well, it's easy enough. You can make other outputs. We're not, bound to just having HTML documents. We can actually have different types of documents, like a PDF as well. And I'll also show you one more, which is a Tufty output, which is like a layout that I tend to like for looking at kind of, or a nice output that I think is visually pleasing. So let's go back to RStudio Cloud, and I am going to open this 04 document here. And I'm going to fix that error that I had that I copied over that we caught in the first one. I am going to turn on the visual editor because why not? And I am going to knit the document before I make changes. So that's probably a good tip that I sometimes forget, but good to have, is like, before you make a change, just knit the document where you think things are going to work. If you want a PDF instead of an HTML, you can simply change things here. And that's easy enough to do. And now the result is basically a PDF document, as you can see. You can change that to a Word document as well if you want. You can also make that change by clicking on the little button here next to knit options and then say, okay, maybe knit it to Word instead. So let's go ahead and knit that. And basically, because I'm running this in the cloud, it says it creates the file for me and then downloads it for me so that I can open it up locally and see the result of my process document in a Word format as well. So that should open up in a second. These are easy enough changes, but some other thing that I wanted to highlight is that we are not bound to just these three options. So there are many other, so here's a Word output, for example. There are many other packages that you can use that make other outputs available to us. So one of the things I wanted to demo here is, something like a Tufty output. So let's go ahead. So that comes from the Tufty package. And let's go ahead and knit the document. And we are going to see that things look a little bit different in terms of the layout. So it has a particular look and a particular background color that's very Tufty-esque. And you can see that that change was pretty straightforward. By changing just the YAML, I'm able to obtain something that looks entirely different. Something that makes Tufty kind of documents different is generally figures tend to be on the margin. So you can actually go ahead and change the chunk option for this figure definition. So I will do this here to big margin true, and let's go ahead and knit it again, and it'll be a little bit easier to see in this format. So it actually moves my figure to the margin by changing that chunk option. So here we've changed the output easily by touching the YAML, and then we were able to then access further chunk options that are available with this additional Tufty package that allows us to do customize our chunks too. So let me show one more thing, and then we'll look at the question. So I am going to go back from Tufty output to HTML document. So let's go ahead and then let's remove that fig margin, which is not going to work with an HTML document. So let's go back to where we started and then demo one other thing. So we've talked about different outputs than HTML, but we can also change how, kind of make some changes in the YAML to how the HTML document is formatted as well. One of my kind of favorite ways, things to do, especially if I'm working on a long document, is to add a table of contents. So that's what the TOC stands for. And then also make it floating. So that's TOC float true. And so let's go ahead and knit this document and in fact pop it into a new window. So we can see that I get this table of contents for free, and it's a floating table of contents that's always visible for me on the sidebar. So this is like almost starting to look like a, you know, a professional web page, simply by adding these two options in the chunk. Let's take a look at the chat or the questions real quick. So in the chat, we have a question: do we need to host the HTML output somewhere prior to sending it out, maybe to collaborators? You could certainly publish it somewhere. One way of publishing an HTML output, especially if it has nothing fancy like interactive and whatnot, is to publish it on RStudio. So we could publish it. It will require a couple new packages to be connected, but basically RPubs, that's the word I was forgetting. You can host it for free on RPubs as long as it's not something private though. Other ways you can publish it is if this is a Git enabled project and you have a GitHub repository, you could, you know, publish them on the GH pages branch of your GitHub repository as well. These HTML documents are self-contained. So if you were to simply email this HTML document to a collaborator and they open it, they'll be able to see the figures and everything as well. So that's really nice that they basically are self-contained documents that they could be emailed around. But I think generally we don't like that. They're not very editable, like they're not human editable necessarily. So what I would recommend is that if you're sharing just the output, in fact, publishing it somewhere, or if you're sharing with a collaborator who's also authoring R Markdown and knows R code, then to, instead of sharing the output, sharing the code with them so that they can reproduce it for themselves. So if we, another question in Slido is for the PDF document, how do I customize it? So the first page has a title only and somewhere at the center of the page and some other footer items. So that's about customizing PDF documents. And my the best way to do that would be to actually have a style file for your that's written in LaTeX. So when we're customizing HTML output, we return to CSS for doing that. So we can write some CSS code to change how our HTML output looks. If we are customizing LaTeX, you basically will want to do something equivalent, but write style files in LaTeX instead. If you're using a particular format, say for something like a journal submission, there is a package called articles. So that is the articles package basically has some journal templates. So you might be able to get the look you need without writing the style file yourself, simply by calling the particular article type that you want to write. And then that would be something that you indicate, just like we did Tufty document here. Instead, we would say articles and then say, I don't know, whatever the name of the journal is, for example. So that would be another way of doing that. And then the other question was, what happens if we put false? I don't know. Let's go ahead and see what happens if we put false. So then it's not a floating table of contents anymore. It's simply included at the top. So floating means that it stays there as you scroll down versus here, it's just on the top of your document. Okay, so let's go back. I know that we're coming up on time. So let's talk a little bit about customizing your theme. So here is, oh, that's an extra slide that does not need to be there. So let me go here. So there are two packages that you might use for customizing the theme of your document. One of them, some of them actually you can do so simply by clicking on this little gear icon here. There are some there are some already built-in themes that you can choose for your code highlighting and the look of your document. But if you want to take fuller control over how your document is themed, two newish packages, one of them is BSLib and the other one is thematic, are super helpful for that. So BSLib provides some tools for customizing Bootstrap themes directly from R. So it makes it much easier to change the appearance of your Shiny apps and R Markdown documents without writing much CSS yourself. And thematic basically then takes those themes and applies it to your plots. So whether that's ggplot2, lattice, or base R graphics, you can apply the themes directly to them. So let's go ahead and demo some of these. So I'm going to open up the fifth document now, O5 theme. Let's go back to RStudio Cloud. Close things we're not using anymore. Close this one as well. I will open up my fifth document. I am going to make that one change that I've been having to make all throughout. And let's go ahead and turn on the visual editor so it's a little bit pleasing to look at. So let's start with the kind of the maybe traditional way of touching some of the themes. So I'm going to click on this little arrow next to the gear icon here and click on output options. And you can see that I can change the syntax highlighting to something else. Let's pick espresso and then change the theme to something else as well. Let's say, I don't know, sandstone, okay? So let's go ahead and click OK. And you can see that this basically brought some options, changed our YAML. And let's go ahead and knit our document to see how those themes have affected things. We can see the look of the font changed and the kind of the coloring changed as well. And we can definitely see how the highlighting of the code changed in the code chunks too. So you have some limited options to pick from there. But if you want to have fuller control and use the thematic package or the BSLib package and the thematic package together for doing this, what I'm going to do is I am going to say, instead of using these preset themes, I'm going to bring in some colors. And these are the colors that I'm grabbing from that R Embaselli package. Let me go ahead and put this in the chat for anybody who wants to try it themselves as well. So I am going to go ahead and knit the document. So these are some hex codes. Ooh, I need to install the BSLib package, which I apparently have not installed here. So while we're talking through it, let me go ahead and install it. So what this is saying is that I'm picking a color for the background, I'm picking a color for the foreground, and then I'm also picking a particular color for that's going to be the primary color for the text and stuff, okay? And so let's wait for that to install the package for a minute. So BG is short for background, FG is short for foreground, and primary is kind of the color of the text, like the primary color of the text. So we have picked a hex color that's like a bluish for the background. FG is the foreground, so that's the text. So that's that kind of cream-like color that we're seeing here. And then we have defined like a brown for the, for example, the links. So that's that brown color that's under the primary. Is there a way to avoid problems caused by install package and special character issues for knit document? So I'm not 100% sure what that is, but if you have special characters in your document, the solution might be something to do with the encoding you use in your document. But if you want to kind of expand on that a little bit more, I can try to answer the question. So we can see that with the BSLib package, we were able to change, just with using the hex codes that we had, we were able to change the look of our document, but our ggplot now really stands out from the rest of it. So what we can do is we can now use the thematic package, and I am going to add this code here. So from the thematic package, I am going to use the function thematic RMD, and it basically turns on theming in the document for me. And when I knit, I can see that actually my ggplot2 has inherited that theming as well pretty easily. Now, one thing you're seeing is that legend background really stands out. And the reason why it's standing out is that I had hard-coded that legend background to be white. So what I might do is I might get rid of that and knit my document again so that it kind of disappears with the rest of that as well. Or maybe I would choose a different color, I'm not sure. Now, this is, I'm now seeing other things that may need to change, right? Maybe we want to change how these years and total rainfall is shown. So you might end up, changing your ggplot2 a bit more to go with the rest of your theme. But this is a really neat way of gaining some ggplot2 themes simply by defining a few colors and at the top of your R Markdown document in the YAML. So I think that's it on theming. And the last thing we're going to talk about is customizing format. So there are lots of various formats that you can use with the same-ish source code. So if you're using R Markdown, you can write a book with Bookdown. You can write websites with things like Blogdown, Distill, or PackageDown. You can write slide decks with SureEngine, and you can make a dashboard with Flex Dashboard, and there are so many more. Each one of these bolded words is an R package, and we're basically saying that once you know how to author things in R Markdown, what you have learned can expand to other things, and you can use what you've learned to create documents in other formats. So what we're going to do is I want to demo for you in a way how easy it is to go from one format to another. So I am going to open up now the last demo file, which is 06 SureEngine. And actually, this is not, SureEngine is one of the packages that you can use for writing text, slide decks. But this itself is not a SureEngine file just yet. I'm just going to correct this one error I had since the beginning. This is that same R Markdown document that we've been working with in forever. So I'm going to walk you through, okay, how do I turn this into a slide deck? Okay, I'm not going to change the title. I'm not going to change the author. I'm not going to change the date. Well, maybe I will change the date today. But I know that I don't want an HTML document as an output anymore. I actually just want a SureEngine document. And in fact, let's go ahead and do a few things. So I will cheat here and bring in a few things from the YAML that I had. This out for now. And so I have a few things defined here. I want some slide numbers. I want my code to be like kind of the highlighting to be made a certain way, so on and so forth. I want a 16:9 ratio for my slides. So those are the wide slides, and I want to basically count the incremental slides. That's it here. But now what I need to do is I need to turn these into slides. So maybe let's give this a title and say, hello. And what I need to do in between each of my sections is to put these kind of slide breaks. So that's the 3 dashes. Let's go ahead and do this. something. So I'm going to have a slide for each one of my sections. And let's go ahead and knit this document to see what we get. And all of a sudden, what we have is the same input, but I have it in slide format. Now, if certain things don't fit, I might think about changing things to see how can I actually fit this plot and this code together here. So one of the things that you might do for that is there is a really neat package called ShareEngine Extra. So I'm going to go ahead and add a chunk here. I'll call that my setup chunk. And I'll say, I don't want to see it in my slides, but I want to be able to use this panel set function from the ShareEngine Extra package. So what that will do is it will allow me to create two panels within my slide. And those two panels, one of them can show the code and the other one can show the output. So let's go ahead and define that. So I'm saying I want two panels, one of them with the code and the other one with the output. And let's go ahead and knit this again and scroll to that slide. So now I can see that my code and my plot are on separate panels and they're a little bit easier to see. Okay, so here is basically something we've done to go from an R Markdown document to a slide deck pretty easily, which means if you're authoring in one thing, but you need your work in now another format, the switch is going to be quite easy to do. There's one other package I will highlight called ShareEngine Themer. And what that allows you to do is it can allow you to kind of change the look of your document pretty easily. And in order to change the look of my document, I am going to change a little bit and bring in like this color theme code that I had that was using the R package to get particular colors. You have this code from the other documents that we've been working with anyway. And then I am going to use the ShareEngine Themer package. There we go. It's that. Use the ShareEngine Themer package to say I want to style my slides with two kind of colors. And I will say that those colors that I want are kind of the primary color is going to be the dark blue that I created above, and the secondary color is going to be the light blue. And then let's just also say that this is going to create a CSS file for me, basically. And I can say that I want to use that CSS file that it creates for me here. And let's go ahead and knit this one more time. So there are two things I've done. I've made the definition of the colors that I want to use using the ShareEngine Themer package, which basically what it does is it creates a CSS file. It writes the CSS for you. And then in your YAML, you're saying, just please go ahead and use that CSS. And as a result, I have a pretty nicely kind of formatted document with the color palette that I wanted. There's a quick question in the chat before I wrap things up. Where do you close the square bracket of panel set? So you open it at the beginning of your R chunk and you close it after the end of your R chunk. So here we've basically shown you how to go from an R Markdown document to ShareEngine. Depending on which format you're going to, the work may be a little bit more, but at least this was a pretty quick transition. By just adding those dashes, I've gone from having sections in a document to slides in my slide deck. If you want to get inspired more by other looks of R Markdown documents, I think the R Markdown gallery is a great place to look. And then we also have a new cheat sheet for R Markdown that also has information about some of the new features of the visual editor and whatnot that I talked about here. So I highly, if you like cheat sheets, I highly encourage you to grab this new cheat sheet, fresh off the press. We finished those just a few weeks ago. And some acknowledgements. I really want to thank the RStudio's R Markdown team. A lot of what I've learned is from materials that they have created, but also the community as well. People are very kind and share their code for the various slide decks and whatnot they create. And I always learn from those. The cheat sheet that I mentioned was created or updated by our intern, Avery Perney, that myself and Garrett Grolleman kind of worked with over the summer. And there's lots of good cheat sheets there if you want to take a look at those. And I want to thank Fernando Campos for that RM Baselli package, and my friend Jenny Tung, who pointed me to that gave me the nice coloring that I used for this. I haven't seen Baselli, but maybe one day. So thank you so much. And you can go to this link to see the slides. And what I will do after the session is push the changes to the documents that I made to the repository and update the RStudio cloud space with basically the answers as well. So if you're watching this after the fact and you want to go through the things that we've gone through, it'll be a little bit easier for you. Thanks a lot.
Awesome. That was excellent. Thank you so much, Dr. Mina. I'm sure everyone enjoyed the session. It's been lively, as you saw from people asking questions. So yeah, I want to thank you so much for taking your time to prepare the very elaborate, in-depth overview of how you can customize our Markdown. And to the participants for being with us, I think since the first session in the morning, and always being with us as we switch from one session to another. So, but I hope everyone has learned something. Personally, I have learned that, you can basically come from a basic Markdown document to a jarring and slide. So I think that's quite a tool for me now.